Right into today with fire management planning with Ian. So go ahead, Ian.
All right. Morning, everybody. Um, so if you've looked at your course agenda, I guess this group's familiar with pen and ink changes to IAPs. So we're going to start the day with a couple. So Barry Kleckler is not going to teach this section. My name's Ian Rickert. I'm going to teach it. So let me introduce myself while I get my screen sharing going here. Let's see. I've been in fire now for around 25 years, 26. So like most folks, I started my career as a boots on the ground firefighter. Worked in 3 different regions. Um, Last 4 years, I've been a part of the Forest Service Regional Office FAM staff as the regional fire planner for Forest Service Region 6 and 10. So my day job covers a lot of different things. I am a professional fire geek, but also try to view the world from the lens of a boots on the ground firefighter. And so what we're going to do here this morning, hopefully you've got my slide deck by now. We're going to step through a couple of different things. And so I know some of you are probably trying to reference PowerPoints and other material in the learning portal. Based on some of the course feedback that the instructors received yesterday, it sounds like fire danger operating plans is one topic that folks wanted more information on. So I changed my slides around last night. Hopefully we can answer some questions that will carry over from yesterday. As I plow through this, there is a lot of material in this particular section. Some of it will appear to be disjointed. Don't worry, we'll do some tactical pauses in there to answer any questions, and I'll do my best to provide a linkage between several different topics. Realize it's first thing in the morning, folks are drinking coffee. Please fire at will with questions. I absolutely love them, and if I'm yakking too long, I'm sure that'll jump in and cut me off and make sure that we answer those things. And so hopefully that's sufficient for an intro. Get rolling here, folks. So like any other training, we're going to start off with some objectives. There are a number of learning objectives for this lesson. Don't worry, everything is going to be distilled down to the key points, right? But generally speaking, this is anchored very, very heavily in policy. It's also anchored very, very heavily in the tools and technologies that we use to synthesize a lot of information and apply it. I'll let you come back to these. I realize it's a lot to digest, but really, we have to start this at a very, very high level before we bring it down to agency-specific policy and what the folks in this room are actually expected to do. We're going to cover these 3. Hopefully, this isn't too much of a repeat, but it's really important in a leadership position, I believe, to understand the origins of policies and really why they exist, right? Why do we have these things? What are the key points behind them? And how does that actually affect us on a day-to-day basis? So first one up on the screen here. The guidance, as a former employee of mine would often say. Honestly, this whole thing originated in the aftermath of the South Canyon fire in 1994. The 3 big policies I'm going to talk to, all of these were driven by congressional legislation, right? And really all of them are intended to provide for interagency coordination, right? Early 90s, way back when agencies pretty much covered their own turf and did their own thing. And so this did a number of things for us. It forced us to start to go down the road of fire management planning. Let's see. It also set the stage for bringing in land and resource management plans and actually making sure those were applied in the context of our fire decision making. This was, of course, modified years down the road. And really, the next policy evolution, if you will, created 2 significant things for us. How do we talk about wildland fire? There's some really key terminology in here. And quite honestly, it's common for us to still ball this up, right? We have 2 distinct types of wildland fire. We have wildfire, which us as practitioners, leaders, agency employees, wildfire, for all intents and purposes, it's ignitions that don't come from us, right? Prescribed fire being the other end of it, right? Obviously, that's very deliberate. But we often bring in terms like fire use and things that have been removed from our lexicon for a long, long time. It's really, really important in terms of communication that we really anchor in what our policy says we should be using. Let's see here. This guidance also gave us WFDS, right? Wildland Fire Decision Support System. I'll step into that in greater detail here in a little while, but really the key thing there is that because wildfire is deemed by federal regulations to be an emergency, if you work for a federal agency, you don't have to do NEPA to make decisions, right? We have to follow our land management plan, but we don't do project level NEPA when we have to make strategic decisions on fires. This policy actually spells out some of how we can navigate our legal authority there. Final one, I believe most folks are pretty familiar with this, the National Cohesive Strategy. And so this was created by the FLAME Act. Really, this took policy evolution one big leap further in that this was intended to apply to all lands in the United States. Think of this as more of an umbrella. The three tenets: resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, safe and effective response. Really, this was intended to bring alignment across a number of different jurisdictions. It's not really aimed exclusively at federal agencies. It's aimed at pretty much everybody, whether it's a state agency, county, local. Really, this is intended to be a building block that we apply. Okay, so let's call that learning objective number 1 met. Now we got to talk about the Red Book, and I know it's first thing in the morning. This is a little painful. There's a couple of key points when it comes to fire management planning, right? What we are tasked with, regardless of the agency you work for, it does stem and tier from the 3 policies that I just talked to. Our planning is intended to tier down from our land management plans, right? Things that have been NEPA-fied. Generally speaking, agency administrators have to approve fire management plans. If you're an FMO, a fire staff, a fire SME in any respect, essentially you are regarded as an SME and you will be recommending things, right? But from a policy standpoint, agency administrators approve. A lot of this information is applied in a formal response decision via WFDS. Okay, we're going to dive into some pen and ink changes here. And so last night, thinking about some of the comments that were submitted by students, it's funny in that we often structure this course similar to how the Red Book is constructed, right? And so planning and preparedness are often talked about as 2 separate things. They are closely related, and I think anyone that's worked in fire for any number of time, for any amount of time, really understands that. This is going to sound like it's going off topic, but I do want to at least frame up the linkage between these. Fire management planning, from a policy standpoint, very, very closely tied to tiering down from your land management plan and how we implement that in typically a response context, right? Preparedness planning, it's the how do we actually get it done piece, right? A lot of that policy is really tied to fire danger operating plans, and I'll come back to those in just a second, make sure everybody understands some of those parts and pieces. Okay, fire management plans. So there's agency-specific direction on those. Generally speaking, most of the Department of Interior agencies, pretty darn similar in terms of how the information is housed. Forest Service, being a USDA agency, does have a pretty significantly different set of requirements, and I'll cover those in greater detail. Department of Interior fire management plans, well, I talked about authority here for a second. Who's actually responsible by policy? Here's an example, right? Reviewed by an FMO and approved by a district manager. Pretty darn similar throughout the DOI agencies in terms of who's actually doing this. What form do they take? Well, there's flexibility in most agency policies. Generally speaking, if you work for DOI, you've got a couple of options. The template that's been used for decades now, typically it takes the form of a printed binder. A little hard to find the answers that you need when you need them. And so most units have moved towards a spatial platform. ArcGIS Online's got a lot of flexibility, and so folks basically build something that looks like a story map. It just has to have all the mandatory pieces for a fire management plan. And again, those are really all anchored on that linkage between going from your land management plan down to the fire specific level. All right, I'm going 1,000 miles an hour here, so jump in the chat with questions. Forest Service policy. There's really two parts. So fire management reference system, that's one. Think of that as more or less a directory of all the different plans and guides that are required by agency policy. That includes a number of different things, right? Your fire danger operating plan is probably the most significant of them because that contains everything that you're going to use on a day-to-day basis for your unit. And it's really a decision-making tool. There's also some other pieces in there that are required by every agency, and most are similar with this respect. There are plans that are oriented on aviation, a number of different things that are tied to mitigation, hazardous fuels management. Prescribed fire often has a whole other subset of plans. But generally speaking, all that stuff falls under that fire management reference system umbrella. Takes the form of honestly what works best for your unit. And so a lot of folks opt for a SharePoint site or something similar. Service first units, typically you've got everything housed in the exact same place. So it could be as simple as a SharePoint site or a file structure that's built in FireNet to ensure that everyone has access to it. Forest Service policy does not spell out exactly where things live. And so if you're a line officer or an FMO, you've got some flexibility there on your end on how you package things and how it's organized. All right. So fire danger operating plans. I do want to talk about that. And this is one that I spend quite a bit of time on in my day job. I think oftentimes we get lost in the nuances of it and all the specific policies. So if you pull up chapter 10 in the Red Book, that's the preparedness chapter. When you look at all of the items that are in there, it's mostly your fire danger operating plan, and it's spelling out the subordinate plans within it as well. The key thing to really remember is that we have those, and they are mandated for Forest Service agencies, optional for others, although highly suggested. It's really all about decision making, right? And it's about pulling apart the different decisions that a fire program has to make over the course of a fire year, fire season, depending on how you want to look at that. A lot of the policy that's in there is all about how we use the National Fire Danger Rating System. That is mandated, but within the system, you've got flexibility in terms of which indices you use, how you use them, and it's all about matching the right tool for the job. This will make more sense in just a moment, I promise. So I'll just let this play out for a second. I have no doubt there's instructors chuckling at the amount of animation in this slide. All right, so conceptual nuts and bolts of a fire danger operating plan. The FDOP's almost an umbrella, right? What you do within that document is make decisions about which fire danger indices you're going to use for a given decision, right? There's a number of different parts and pieces within the FDOP that are really, really significant for everybody to understand. And so we're just going to start at the top here. How do you set preparedness levels locally? We're not talking about the GAC. We're not talking about national. Each dispatch center has to set a preparedness level, right? There's also actions that are associated with those levels. And so the preparedness plan, the nuts and bolts of it, really spell those out. A staffing plan. When you think about an energy release component chart or really any other fire danger metric, how does that look over the course of a summer, right? The staffing plan is really built on that and applies it so that we are increasing our capacity or response as conditions worsen. And then we are actually loosening up the number of things that we need to have on hand on any day as conditions moderate, right? It's really that simple, right? The staffing plan is going to spell that stuff out. Typically, there are provisions in there for severity, right? And there's specific agency policy that hits on that. Generally speaking, if you work for the Forest Service, you have really extreme conditions, ERCs over the 90th percentile, there's a mechanism for you to get extra funding so that you can have extra resources. There's agency-specific policy on all that, but there's a clear linkage to the staffing plan there too. Let's see, dispatcher response plan. Those two terms are really used interchangeably, but for you FMOs out there, boils down to your run cards, right? You get a reported ignition in a given part of your unit. That spells out, generally speaking, what you're going to send based on the conditions that day, right? So that can be as simple as sending one engine early in the season when your conditions are pretty moderate, but August in the midst of a wind event, and let's say we've got a red flag warning that day, odds are it's going to be a very, very different initial attack response, right? Right-hand side of this slide, these are all internal tools that I'm talking about, right? So we also use fire danger in our fire danger operating plan to delineate, plan out in advance, and agree to how we're going to communicate with both the general public and industry, right? We have prevention plans. And so that facilitates us to decide a couple of things, right? Number one, how are we going to communicate fire danger to the general public, right? Everyone's familiar with the Smokey Bear sign. That's probably the most basic example of it. Yet for you line officers in here, there's a couple of other things that are also very significant, right? Fire restrictions being one of them. Most of the audience here is familiar with PNW, public use restrictions, right? And then, of course, we've got IFPL, Industrial Fire Precaution Level, right? How are we going to restrict industry, essentially, based on a fire danger metric? Key thing to remember there with all of these, ultimately what we're trying to do with fire restrictions or IFPL, we're trying to reduce human caused ignitions, right? So it's really, really important when folks are reviewing these plans or constructing them from the ground up that we are focused in on a small subset of our fire problem, right? It's not everything. I guess final piece here, there is policy with respect to when we can use prescribed fire as a tool. At least for the Forest Service, this is significant. We have extreme fire danger. We have to, at the unit level, request permission from the regional forester to actually do that, right? That's pretty clear-cut policy. Okay. Hopefully this is landing with folks. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Briefly touched on this, and sorry to give you alphabet soup here first thing in the morning. This is a question that often comes up. What does my agency actually require, right? So Forest Service requires a fire danger operating plan. Most of the DOI agencies give you a little bit more flexibility in there. A fire danger operating plan, I would say, is more comprehensive compared to the other alternatives. The others are really a more simplistic version, and it's less heavy on actually using that to make pre-planned decisions. Our state agencies, our state partners here in PNW, they are proponents of the fire danger operating plan. So the good thing with PNW, or at least something that I think we all ought to be very proud of, is the fact that all of our plans are really interagency in nature. If you don't know that your unit has a fire danger operating plan, and this is all brand new to you, what I would encourage you to do is go to our GAC website, click on the Fuels and Fire Danger tab, and you will see a list right here. The GAC does update this annually, and so if there's a plan on here that gets updated over the winter, and there will be 2 that I know of, Blue Mountain's in the midst of doing an update that covers the entirety of that dispatch area, and then the central and northeastern Washington plans being updated as well. Bottom line, go click that link, gain a little familiarity with that. Those are pretty long documents, but typically they're pretty well structured, and so you can get some answers on how your unit's doing things, or at least what's pre-planned. So that was a bit much, I'm sure. Let me just do a quick pause here and make sure that everyone's still out there. Questions? Anybody?
Ian, I didn't see Fish and Wildlife Service on the FDOP table there. It's my understanding that's not required. Any knowledge on that?
Yeah, that's a big oops on my end, so apologies for that, but that's correct. Yep. Suggested, but technically optional.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I noticed there's some differences in the slideshows that was provided to us on the portal and what you're presenting.
Yes.
Just wanted to see if we're going to be able to get an update provided on the portal to get what you're presenting on.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem. I made some last minute pivots last night to try.
Well, I thought I was losing my mind trying to track it on follow along.
No.
Okay. Thanks.
You're not. You're not. No, we'll get everything flipped around on the portal. But okay, anybody else? Where can I find guidance on the development of run cards? Ooh, okay. That's one. There actually are some great examples in there if you just look at fire danger operating plans. In particular, the response plan part. I can send you those. There's also some resources on the web. It would probably take me about 10 seconds to dig up the NWCG page on fire danger operating plans, but there's some good examples in there. So maybe when we take a break, I'll throw that in the chat for folks. I'll say this. Really any agency has a lot of flexibility when it comes to creating run cards. I guess what I would personally recommend, having watched and coached folks through this for the better part of 15 years all over the Western US, the key thing is to really look at response planning in an interagency context. That's generally speaking how we fight fire and how we respond, right? Don't look at that through the lens of your specific unit or agency. The other thing you want to do with those, if you don't have run cards or a solid response plan, create one and test it. Literally play battleship with it. Create some mock fire situations where you just pull up a map and go, okay, let's put a fire here, here, and here, and then game out where the resources are going to come from and how they're going to go. A lot of units don't do that, and ultimately you end up putting something on paper that's really theoretical, and you can't really implement it when the time comes. So yeah, but I will throw some resources in there so that you can look at some examples. Anything else? Okay. I'm gonna plow ahead here, folks. Give you a break in about 15. I got to switch gears. I told you I'd do it a couple times. Apologies. Wooftus. And so I think Brett Smith did a pretty solid job yesterday teeing this up. And obviously there's an exercise that you're going through that I think will help you with Wooftus. Just table setting here. Federal agencies are required to use that system. The decisions that are published within it are published by an agency administrator with the appropriate qualifications. Documents a number of things that I think everyone's familiar with, right? Risk, organizational needs, objectives, strategy, etc. The key point, the underlined part of the slide right on the bottom, the workflow is intended to apply your land and resource management plan content. So what we're talking about this morning, this is all about pre-planning. Part of Wooftus can be pre-planned, right? Some of that content. So spatial fire planning in Wooftus. There is policy around this. You will find that in Chapter 9 of the Red Book. Generally speaking, this is something that is the responsibility of the district manager. If you're BLM, it's the forest supervisor for Forest Service. Typically, it's that head agency administrator for a given unit. Here's what happens. Typically, most of the folks on this call are not going to be actually doing the button clicking and setting this up. This is typically delegated, although ultimately the line officer with the appropriate authority has to approve the content. The premise of it is this, and this is a Forest Service requirement that we do this. You take all of your land and resource management plan content, right? There's GIS shape files, and there's a lot of different tabular direction, right? Text that is specific to a given place on the ground on your unit. Someone that works for your unit that has the data manager role in Wooftus will take all of that, and essentially you are loading in polygons to the Wooftus system, and there is text associated with each of these, right? And this can cover a myriad of different topics. It really just depends on what's in your land management plan. Some of it's going to be centered on basic protection objectives. Some of it will be about how you handle certain habitat types. Some of it's going to be about specific land designations, wilderness being a very common one. It can cover a number of different things depending on the agency that you work for. But generally speaking, the process is pretty simple. It's intended to take your land management plan, preload or get into Wooftus all of the things that are pertinent to response. And then when you have a fire, you're going to be narrowing your lens, right? Spatially, we're looking at an explicit part of your unit. And legally, we have to apply those parts of our land management plan in those decisions. Okay, here's where things get a little bit more convoluted. There's a way we've always done fire planning in Wooftus, and there's what we are transitioning to. So if there are tenured line officers on here or tenured FMOs, you probably have some familiarity with strategic objectives and management requirements. If you're a DOI person, you spent most of your career there, you're probably familiar with fire management units. Bottom line, those terms are really just related to how you package information up. That's going away. So if you're completely lost here, don't sweat it. The next version of the Wooftus application is going to be rolled out, and we will be expected to use it for fire season 2025. And I'm going to show you some changes here that are really specific to fire planning. Hopefully I don't lose folks here, but I do at least believe in people getting some level of training and understanding on this stuff before we're actually forced to make it all work. Here's what's going to happen. All of our existing spatial fire planning content, and so guarantee you folks on here, you've already got something in place for your unit. What happens is it's going to be moved into one of 4 different buckets, right? And so I know this is pretty confusing, but when you think about what's on paper for your land management plan, it's actually pretty easy to categorize it, right? We have some direction that applies for the entire unit itself, right? So if you happen to work on, let's say, the Malheur National Forest, there are things in your forest plan that apply to the entire unit, right? There's guidance. There are other land management plan items, statements, directives that apply to a smaller part, a part of your, let's just call it a subunit, right? So essentially, this is intended to break up the LRMP guidance specific to fire so that it can be applied in the right context. Just an example of what this is going to look like in Next Gen WFDS. Note there's a big change in here from what you've been using for the last decade or so. When you log in, your screen's going to look like this. Relative risk, really not a whole lot of change there in terms of content. The user interface will look a bit different. But once you get to this strategy piece, what we used to do in WFDS is look at all of the preloaded content, then create objectives and requirements for our fires, right? There would be another tab that was course of action where we would put in statements regarding strategy. Essentially what the WFDS Next Gen team has done is merge those 2 things together. There's a reason for it. Our land management plan content, our preloaded content, oftentimes it really speaks to and informs both things, right? Right. We tier from it when we create incident objectives and requirements. We also tier from it when we're determining our optimal strategy, right? So the way the workflow works, you pull this up, you've got your fire. You can turn on a number of different layers in the system, but in terms of preloaded shapes and content, there's a couple of different things in here that you'll be able to choose from. Those 4 categories I just talked to, those are in here. They're also going to include pods, and I'll get to pods here towards the end of this. Generally speaking, if you work in the Northwest, there's really no language associated with pods, but you can only see the shape. What you would do once you click on one of those, it's going to tell you right here what it is, right? Okay, let's say this is relevant to the Wiley Flat Fire. From there, you're going to select how it should be included in your decision. So you'll have options in there, strategic goals. It can be added in there as an objective, a requirement, and then you will have to click on include in decision, hit save, and then it gets fed into the rest of your WFDS decision. That's essentially the workflow in a nutshell for this one. All right, I talked about this a little bit more, but I think the bottom line is this. Within that strategy tab that I just showed you, don't worry, there's going to be a number of different training sessions on Next Gen WFDS. I realize it's new. It's going to be pretty important from my viewpoint that we go through all of the different preloaded content that shows up there, right? It's going to be pretty easy, I think, from a mechanic standpoint for us to be able to cherry pick, just put in something in the text box and move on. However, that's a really good way to get in trouble from my perspective. And so you agency administrators, you line officers on here, please write this one down. WFDS decisions, especially for our large, complex, politically sensitive fires, that's a document that lands in court. And believe me, I have spent a long time watching this transpire. Any significant fire, I guarantee you that the WFDS decisions that are approved are picked up by a number of different lawyers. It's really, really important that we're as thorough as we can be, especially on those large, complex, costly, potentially controversial incidents. Okay. think we're a little bit ahead of schedule here. Planning a break at the top of the hour. Let me see if I can grab a few more questions. Anybody got one?
Right. Ian.
Fire at will. What you got?
So if I'm not super familiar with WoofDisk, but if with next gen WoofDisk, are you able to, so you got Wiley flat fire and then another fire popped up similar area. The landscape geography all look kind of the same, probably similar objectives. Can you still plug in, Wiley Flat's information, WoofDisk into it, and then edit your new fire based off of that?
Essentially, can you copy content from one decision to another?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I'll be honest. The book answer is that you shouldn't do that, right? But I also realize that when you're trying to knock out a WoofDisk decision for several incidents, it's PL5. You're tired. It's 10 o'clock at night. Yes, you can certainly grab the relevant pieces from one incident and copy it to another.
Just to add on what Mike asked there, I think to avoid just kind of getting yourself stuck where you cut and paste maybe something that you meant to change. If you cut it paste into a Word document first, you can do a quick edit on it and make sure you've changed what you need to, and then cut it in. It just gives you that extra little check on what you're doing, so you're not getting into that rote cut and paste where maybe you move something in that you didn't want to.
Yep. Great point, Lisa.
Only because I've done it.
Well, I'm with you. I have as well. All right. That was a lot. Let's do this. So we've got a 10-minute break built into the schedule. Let's come back at 9:05. Everyone stand up, drink some coffee, stretch, do some push-ups, whatever you need to do. We'll get rolling at 9:05. And what we're going to do for the latter half of this, we're going to start talking about some of the other tools that are out there and I know folks heavily use. And so what I threw up on the screen here, just a couple of tickler questions to get you thinking. I think when I first took this course, quite a while ago, but a lot of the topics that were covered in this particular section, I hadn't read my unit's fire danger operating plan, and I couldn't answer basic questions that I should be able to answer when I read the FMP. So I'm going to leave this up here. Once you grab a cup of coffee, take a read, think about these questions, and then maybe come back to your home unit after this class and ask some really good questions of your own. So we'll see you at 9:05. The good stuff. We spent the last 45 minutes talking about policy, what's required and expected of us. Most of what we're going to round this morning session out on are things that are really optional, but quite honestly, it's the things that we tend to use a whole lot. I think one of the most challenging things with fire management planning, we are constantly being bombarded with tech transfer, the newest, greatest, most wonderful tool on the planet. We all have to drink through a fire hose, it seems. And so the way I tend to look at this, there are a number of different things out there that we might be able to use on our home units. Some are probably better than others. Ultimately, I don't know that it's up for me to decide. I can certainly give you recommendations, but what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes, we're not going to talk about every single tool in the toolbox, so to speak. We're going to talk about the key ones, and we're going to try to get these things organized so that we understand what that tool can do for us and for what purpose, right? And so the images up here are really intended to give you a chuckle. At the same time, we're not going through all this stuff. We're going to talk about the duct tape and the WD-40 type stuff. It's not going to be everything here. So buckle up, ask me all the questions you want. A lot of this is what I do for a day job. So Here we go. First one. Who's heard of quantitative wildfire risk assessments? Anybody? I know some of you coaches sure have. But how about students? Just give me a reaction. Okay, if you haven't, not a big deal. All right, so for this course, I'm not going to go off in a left field anymore here and talk about the science end of it. Look at the bottom part of this PowerPoint slide. I think as an agency administrator, these are pretty darn important questions, right? From a planning standpoint, we have scarce resources, right? We have X number of dollars for hazardous fuels or any of our mitigation work. We know that we're challenged in a response context. It's really important for us to know where are the most important values on my landscape and how do they react to fire, right? We need a vehicle that we can use to sit down with our partners and actually be on the exact same sheet of music, right? Again, it's not really intended to capture everything. We're talking about the most important values and assets here. And so ultimately, what this whole framework is intended to do is answer some pretty challenging questions and do so in a scientifically defensible manner. So a lot of folks get lost on what this can actually do for you and what the steps are. So I'm going to do my best to spell that out here. First and foremost, everybody that works in PNW, you've got an analysis you can use. It covers every single acre in Oregon and Washington. The first step is really defining and looking at fire hazard, right? And so we're looking at likelihood and intensity, right? These are different things. How likely are we to have a large incident? And when one occurs, what kind of fire behavior are we going to see? The next piece of this, we stack on a number of different GIS layers with the intention of ultimately framing wildfire risk. But we're not focused on everything, right? And so what are those big ticket items within our analysis area, which is Oregon and Washington in this case? So it's got to have a map layer. The next step, and it's not really important for you guys to do any of this work. This has already been done for you. We have an all lands quantitative wildfire risk assessment for Oregon and Washington. That was an interagency effort and will continue to be. Once you've got your values identified, this is where specialists come in. We're essentially framing up how said value responds to fire in a physical sense, right? And so there are some values where it's straight up a loss and we have issues regardless of the flame length, right? And so if you think about how fire interacts with a home or a communication site, regardless of the flame lengths, it's a negative, right? That is not necessarily the case with a number of different habitat types, right? In many cases, low intensity fire is actually a benefit. High intensity fire might cause loss or a negative impact to that, right? So the whole point of a QWRA is to essentially synthesize all of those different moving parts and pieces into one final set of map layers. The other piece of this puzzle, not to oversimplify this framework, but it also accounts for relative importance, right? So should have picked a better graphic here, but this large piece of the pie here in the light blue, people and property is what that stands for, drinking water and infrastructure, if you can see my cursor. And so how this gets done, it's essentially state foresters and agency leadership that are voting and setting on those, right? And so that is informed by a number of different scientific, a number of different studies. But ultimately, I think it's pretty safe to say that some values, at least from a societal standpoint, are highly prized. And so relative importance can be adjusted to reflect those views, right? I think that generally aligns with how we make decisions in a response context as well, right? End all be all. where you land with this particular framework, it's a layer that looks like this one. It goes through and summarizes where we are most likely to have loss or benefit from a fire to a whole suite of values. If you've got a more explicit question and you simply want to look at where you're most likely to have loss to one value, let's say the urban interface or drinking water on your unit, there's a layer for that too. And so that's really the nuts and bolts of this one. For this audience, the key thing to know is that you can find these layers on the RMA dashboard. If you can't find the exact thing you're looking at, there are a number of different web portals where there's more information to be found, more specific layers. There's a small subset of them, kind of the top 5 commonly used layers from our risk assessment, which you can find right here. If what you're looking for a more specific planning question isn't on the RMA dashboard, I believe DNR has a pretty slick web portal. I haven't looked at it in a couple of months, but it was fantastic when I saw it last. And there's a number of different web applications there that have those. And so I'll throw my contact info in the chat here, and I'll put some hot links in when I'm done yakking. Okay, that's number one. While we're on this topic, I do want to at least talk about the RMA dashboard. Has anybody not seen this yet? Let's ask that question. Okay, right on. Looking at it now, copy that. All right, it's not a big deal if you haven't seen it. So maybe what we'll do here is, if I've got a little bit more time before we're done with this section, I will just pull it up on the web and give you a quick tutorial, and we'll just zip around and look at some stuff. But when you click on it, if you've never seen it before, just Google RMA dashboard. It'll take you right there. This top menu right here, there's a number of different things on here. If this is all new to you, what I would highly recommend you do is just go to the map viewer. That's probably the most commonly used piece of it. Some of these other things are, generally speaking, used by analysts, and it's really used for answering pretty explicit questions. Anyone can do it, but I'm just saying some of it is a little bit more in the weeds. What you can find on here, if you clicked on all these different layers, you can answer questions regarding values at risk. There's all sorts of reference layers on there for jurisdictional boundaries, risk assessment results. You can see fire history. You can see fuel treatment history. You can turn on layers that show you where we have fires going on in the continental United States right now. Essentially, this is like a situational awareness clearinghouse. The good thing about this, and there is a hot link right here when you get this slide deck, it's wide open on a publicly accessible site, which, let's be honest, most of the tools we have available to us, we've got to have yet another password to access them. This one, at least the most basic form of it, you just click on the URL, takes you right there, right? So certainly an advantage there. Yes, I will say from the map viewer, pretty important, you click up top here on the GAC that you're sitting in, or at least the GAC of interest. That does filter the map layers. And so if you're looking at everything, you're just going to have to wade through a lot more stuff to find the layer of interest. Clicking on the PNW one will certainly help you get to where you want to be a little bit faster. So thank you for throwing that link in the chat there. Okay. Within the RMA dashboard, there's a number of analytics that anybody can use. So I'm going to briefly touch on the big four, if you will. There's definitions and all sorts of additional reading material on these, but I'm going to give you the very, very basic Ian filter on all this. So here's number one. ground evacuation time. So when you go to the layer list in the RMA dashboard, you can find this one. All of these, I'll say first, they're updated annually. And that is done because disturbance, wildfire, harvest, fuel treatment, any of those things can obviously change vegetation composition. And so these products have to be updated on an annual basis to reflect at least last summer's fire activity, among other things. And so look for this to be updated spring of each year. Okay, ground evacuation time. It's really intended to answer a simple question. If we get an injured firefighter anywhere on this map, how long is it going to take to get him to the next level of care, right? And we all know that that's a byproduct of a number of different things, right? Proximity to roads, trails, vegetation, slope. When you start to look at how to quantify that, a number of different variables come into play. But this is a great reference for you. Whether you're an FMO or a line officer, this certainly has relevance when we're going to make strategic decisions. Next one, suppression difficulty index. So I'll be honest, when this first came out, I almost laughed at it because I thought it was oversimplifying something that anyone that was familiar with their local area should know. But I've since seen the relevance in this. The suppression difficulty index is really intended to answer a very basic question. How hard is it to, in a relative sense, how hard is it to engage in suppression on a given pixel or a given place? Right, and when you think about it, that's also tied to a number of different things. Steepness, access, likely fire intensity, a bunch of other things that I think all us fire practitioners go, yeah, duh. However, the value in this layer is that oftentimes we end up working with cooperators that may not have the same mental model we do, right? So it can be nice and handy at times to be able to pull up a map and with pretty simple symbology show red being the highest difficulty and blue being the lowest and what's in between, right? And then have a discussion regarding strategy and all the things that we often talk about. There is some utility here, even though this may seem like a yeah, duh one to some. Okay. Number 3, potential control location, or PCL. Answers a slightly different question. So, how likely are we to be successful in containing a fire or a fire stopping on the landscape, right? So it's similar to SDI, but a little bit different and a little bit more specific. From a science perspective, this is certainly more intensive in that this is all created by looking at all of the historic perimeters over the entire United States, but really intended to answer a slightly different question, right? If our objective is containing a fire, where are we most likely to be successful here, right? And obviously on this particular example, you can see that there's a very clear change here in how it's rated. Well, that's a fire scar, right? We all know intuitively, I think, that large fires that are burning in areas that have not seen disturbance in quite a while, typically when they run into fresh fire scars, they're going to slow down, if not stop, right? That's kind of what this is showing you, right? So as a communication tool, this is something else that you can use. Really, that's its intended purpose. All right, and final one, snag hazard. I think this is pretty intuitive, right? The rating here, I'll be honest, this is actually a pretty solid layer, although when you zoom right in, if you're looking at relative snag hazard for, let's say, a single tree incident, really, really fine scale applications of this is, I would say, a moderately useful tool. If it's a larger incident, it does far better, and that's just a byproduct of resolution. Really, a key point on this one is, what is this data set reflecting? It's snag hazard, right? So dead trees, right? That's what this is showing you. Oftentimes this is misapplied, right? So for those of you that ever fought fire on the west side, green trees can certainly be an enormous hazard there, right? I think we all know that. This does not show you anything about the probability or likelihood of a green tree falling and the relative exposure associated with that, okay? It's just dead trees. So know that in advance when you go to use this. Trying to catch up on the chat here. Yes, that last comment regarding seems to focus on old fire scars and doesn't do as well to capture large-scale vehicle. That's true. I agree with that statement. It's also an area where the folks that build this stuff are actually trying to really improve that. We know we've got a lot of pathogens and disturbance out there. I can think of a handful of places in Southwest Oregon in particular that are very concerning. They are trying to update the methods on this, so it's a little bit more comprehensive. I totally agree with that, that right now what you got up on the screen, it's very much reflected to fire severity. And yes, how this relates to ISAP, we're going there, don't worry. Before we get to ISAP, one more common one, and you can find this data on the RMA dashboard. Pods, potential operational delineations. Often there's questions about the origins of this data and what it's really used for. So honestly, think about this as just compartments for fire management, right? We tend to think of stands and silviculture. Range has their own compartment. A lot of our different natural resources are ultimately viewed in the context of a small spatial footprint, right? Fire, we all know this, tends to ignore jurisdictional lines. So pods are really our version of how to compartmentalize the landscape into some digestible pieces. So how we do this, frankly, it's as simple as sitting down with all your partners within your local geography, pulling up a series of maps, and then creating lines and polygons around the features that are really the best ones out there for engaging in fire suppression, right? Those can be ridge lines, those can be road systems, that can be the edge of a fire scar. It can be a lot of different things, right? There's tons of literature, guidance for how to work through that process, and I can arm you guys with whatever you'd like on that topic. Let's see, how do you use the data? Well, honestly, a lot of the time it's used in a response context, but last few years in particular, we're seeing a lot of applications in the fuels world, right? Pretty nice reference data set when we're looking at where should we be locating strategic fuel placement. There's plenty of tools on the RMA dashboard where you can click on a pod and a pop-up menu shows you all the values within it and a number of other information, right? And so it's a nice way to summarize QWRA outputs and a bunch of other data sets. Okay. Now we'll get into this ISAP application piece. So I know you had a presentation on ISAP yesterday, and I'm sure this slide was out there in one form, right? 4 pillars. This morning's topic, it's really all about pre-planning, right? What can we do before there's actually smoke in the air to make our lives a little bit easier, right? I'm not going to go through the 4 pillars with detail. I believe you've already got that. What I am going to do, I went too fast here. Let's talk about this first one and how we might be able to gain some efficiency within the ISAP process and apply some of these tools. So we're going to start with pillar number 1, critical values at risk. And then you want to hear a little bit more on how to tie some of those RMA analytics to the rest of these. We'll come back to that. Gosh, I threw this slide in here last night thinking it was a nice way to connect a couple of different tools, processes out there. But it's a lot to wrap your head around. So let me just step you through it. I think it's important that we understand intent behind a lot of this. So this is going to be my graphic aid for that. This is how I see our planning world right now in terms of three major tools, technologies, investments. WFDIS is a tool we are mandated to use as federal agencies, right? The Risk Management Assistance Dashboard, RMA, that program and that tool set that lives on the web is another. And the last few years we've had ISAP, right? So RMA, think of that as a way of maintaining situational awareness, and think of that as a bunch of analytics that are built so that any agency, any unit can access and apply them in strategic planning, right? ISAP, relatively new. And what do we do in ISAP, right? We identify critical values at risk, not all values, right? Just the ones that are the most important to all the stakeholders impacted by that fire, or potentially impacted, right? And then we step through developing a strategy to mitigate impacts to those values. And we weigh the risk and alternatives, right? Those are the four pillars in a very basic sense. You do something similar in WFDIS. I personally think that we are seeing ISAP for a number of reasons. Number one, we can't answer all the key questions with WFDIS, right? When you look at the WFDIS structure, there's nothing that forces you to view and weigh alternatives. You can complete all the requirements of a WFDIS decision by simply saying, this is my preferred alternative, right? And the system will let you actually approve a decision. It's not the right way to do it, but you can. WFDIS is also a system that's used primarily by a federal audience, right? That really doesn't help us when we have a fire and we have a delegation of authority that lists local partners and cooperators on there, right? Those folks obviously have a seat at the table with strategic decision making, but there's really no way to bring them into anything formal if we're solely relying on WFDIS, right? And so hence we've got now this conglomeration of tools. And there's a lot of efforts in place nationally to try to simplify this stuff and bring it into one cohesive push forward. It's getting there, but I think we've got a ways to go. In the world of pre-planning and thinking about all this stuff before there's smoke in the air, I think it's really important to focus on that first pillar of ISAP and use of the RMA dashboard and some of the tools that are there, and really how we can start to help ourselves when it comes to WFDIS decisions. I'll get into more of this here in just a moment, right? Critical values, right? That first pillar. An example from a fire last year, right? There's a number of different values in play, right? And again, critical, we're not talking about everything, just the ones that, frankly, we typically spend millions, if not billions of dollars protecting over the course of a given fire season, right? The things that often float to the top. We know what the list is, right? Urban interface, homes, big one. Infrastructure's typically right up there. Drinking water, if there's a municipal watershed. And oftentimes, they're commodity values, right? High value timber sales, agricultural lands, things of that nature, right? Bad driving on my part. You can, if you're an FMO or a line officer, identify those for your unit pre-season, right? We don't have to wait until there's a big fire to do that, right? There is nothing stopping you. In fact, it's suggested by our policy for you to work with your partners in advance on an interagency basis. And so when we distribute this PowerPoint, just going to give you an option. You can click on this hot link here, and it's going to take you to an ArcGIS Online layer that has at least the most commonly used critical values in ISAP. All right, and those are the things that I just mentioned, right? It's not intended to be inclusive and cover everything, right? But this is built so that if you want a basic layer to come into next summer when you host an incident management team and you have to do the ISAP process, you can gain a lot of efficiency by having pillar one done ahead of time, right? What you can do with this for your unit is go in there and add in values that might be missing. We created a layer here that has every last acre in Oregon and Washington. And this is really just to give every agency a starting point. What you can do is go in there and actually list the relative priority for a value and do the same thing with severity, right? Part ISAP is looking at susceptibility of any of those critical values. You can populate other information there that might be necessary at the time too. So the idea here is just to give folks a jump start. To come back to the RMA dashboard, you can see this layer from there. And you should be able to add it to Next Gen WFDS as well. So frankly, it can actually kill a few birds with one stone. I said I would go back to focus on application of some of those RMA layers. So I'm going to go a little off script here. See if I can answer that question. So snag hazard, suppression difficulty index, potential control location, right? And definitely the ground evac. When you think about what we're trying to do with pillar 3 and 4 of the ISAP process, right? Framing risk to responders based on a given strategic option. You can use those reference layers to at least look at trade-offs between two different options, right? It can be as simple as direct versus indirect, right? Pull those map layers up, look at where those two options are going to be, where the line placement will be, and just using the basic color coding on there, you're going to be able to draw some conclusions on there that are pretty defensible, right? That can help you answer that question, risk to responders. Probability success, honestly, I think that one takes a little bit more thought. Typically, that's one where you're going to start to bring in some fire behavior modeling, FS Pro runs in particular. But you can also use that PCL layer to help you at least look at, in a relative sense, is one option just have a higher probability of success versus another. But I think everyone knows that this last one's probably the most challenging when you're really thinking critically about it. Hopefully that answers that question. All right. What else you folks got? We got about 15 minutes here, and I was planning on sparing you from death by PowerPoint and talking RMA dashboard and doing a little tour, if that sounds good. Crickets? Everybody still out there? Right on. Okay.
I think that would be good. I was having trouble. I was playing on it while you were presenting earlier and having trouble finding some of the tabs underneath those. So scanning through each of them and couldn't find some of it that you were showing.
All right. Well, let's see if I can help you out here then. Okay. If folks have questions on anything else that we talked about, I know this kind of goes, this last couple hours we went all over the place. Just throw them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them, or feel free to come off mute and just say something. We'll start here with the very, very basics. So if you just Google this, you're going to land on this page. Some of these hot links, if you're really curious about a couple of the different things that I just talked about, if you click on these, it'll give you ultimately a link to the journal articles that were used to create some of those layers. There's a number of other things on there that I'm going to skip through because I think folks, generally speaking, go straight to the map viewer, and this is probably the most common tool here. So go to PNW. I'm just going to step through the layer tree really quick and just give you an overview so it hopefully helps you find things when you need it. Start at the top. So current incidents detection. I guess first things first, let's declutter this map. Life a little better. All right. Pretty early in the year, so looking at fire perimeters from the current season is probably not all that useful. But that's how things are set up and preloaded. Just pick a random place on the landscape. And assume for a second we've got an incident, area of interest. So I can just start turning these different things on and off just to get some base essay, right? So historical fire perimeters are a big one. If you've got sketchy intel on fire behavior, fire growth, exact location of the incident, veers, modus, fire guard, there isn't much to look at right now, but that's all remote sensing data that's going to show you at least thermal imaging, right? Where do we have heat detected? Alert wildfire cameras. That's a pretty cool new feature. And so what you can do is turn this on. And if there's a camera in the general vicinity, you can click on said camera and it'll redirect you so that you can see what's going on out there in real time. Generally speaking, all of this stuff works pretty seamlessly. The one thing I will say is that if you have a NIFC ArcGIS Online account, instead of going to the basic map viewer here, you can click on this internal one. Looks very much the same. It is going to force you to log in though. And so the advantage of doing this is that there are a few more additional map layers. I'm not going to show you right now because I've got to log in. At least within this detection bin up top here, it's going to give you some better options, I would say, at least with FireGuard and some of the other remote sensing stuff. Just a few more, I would say, just better ways of gaining SA on current fire location and fire growth, notably with a large incident. So key difference there. Weather and climate. So a lot of these things are, let's see, it's going to show you precipitation, significant fire risk, which is the predictive services polygon, essentially color coded. Not much to look at right now, given the time of year. Red flag warnings and watches. And then there's a number of other layers in here where you can turn on and off. Click on a ROS location, and it's going to show you some information about wind speed, things of that nature. So this is pretty basic. Quite honestly, if you're a fire staff officer, FMO type, this is probably more in your wheelhouse. But there you go. Historic infrastructure. So I talked values. There are national data sets that you can use and reference. And so most of the key ones are going to be found in this infrastructure subset. One thing that I didn't talk about, and most folks don't even know this exists, there are bookmarks for each GAC. So if you go right up here and you can see my cursor, you can bookmark places, add ArcGIS Online layers exclusively for PNW, right? I'll get them to turn it back on. There should be something up here that redirects you to a couple of data sets that are only available for our region, but it looks like they turned it off at the moment. So that'll be back on there for fire season. Let's see, strategic analytics branch stuff, right? I just talked about snag hazard, ground evac time, suppression difficulty index, PCL. So that's where you're going to find those. Again, those are all refreshed on an annual basis. One I talked to very, very briefly, but didn't show you all that well. Pods. So if you're going to have pods created, here's this big old messy layer, right? One of the things that we do every single year, we set this up so that when you click on a pod, you gain some additional information. So Go to Strategic Analytics, Branch Analytics. How's that for a tongue twister? Go to this top layer, Pods with Risk Assessment Summary. When I do this, I've got an inventory for all the stuff that happens to be in that polygon, right? Slowly go through this, and it's going to give me data on what I've got out there for critical values. And if you're a big fire data geek like me and you want to see QWRA results summarized by that pod, there you go. There's one way to get it. All right.
Hey, Ian,
Speaking-
since you're on the pods there, if there's a line within a pod as a fire manager and you don't think that line makes sense anymore or needs to be tweaked, how do you get those lines updated?
Good question. So every agency, I would say, has more or less a point of contact for pods. So let's see. Ed, for you, that would be Anna Barros. Typically, she coordinates most of the edits. If you work on a BLM or a Forest Service unit in PNW in Region 6, go to your local fire planner. Your fire staff will certainly know how to redirect those requests internally. Park Service, I do believe Patty Johnson, who's a regional planner, would be your best bet. But the long and short of it, this is a GIS data set that we can change literally any day of the year. It's managed through ArcGIS Online. And so you're right. If you don't like these features, they can be changed. It does take somebody with the right GIS know-how to do it. I guess a key point with pods that I glossed right over, there is no mandate to create this data set. I know it's often viewed as kind of a Forest Service push, if you will, but there's no agency policy that says thou shalt have pods, right? To be honest with you, this is really taken off as a pretty organic effort. And frankly, we're maintaining the data because there's utility in it. So when we get a large fire and we're talking about indirect options, typically we're pulling up pods as a pretty good reference there, right? Once you get a CIMT in place and folks start to scout and get a little bit better intel, we don't always land on these pods. But honestly, I've looked at this data, I don't know how many times with respect to where's our final fire perimeter and where we actually get containment. Especially on the west side, generally speaking, the pod boundaries pretty darn representative. But I think, Ed, where you were really going here, if it's outdated because these lines were used last year, or we had a really big fire that burned up, let's just say 2 polygons, we should be updating this every single year annually to at least reflect the big disturbances on the landscape. That's a best practice. And really each agency on here would have a point of contact, if you will, within the region for helping facilitate that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. It was a question that was in the chat, and I think solely
Okay, I got it.
good answer.
Right on. Figures it was Sullivan that asked that question. Right on. It's a good one, though. Okay. Let me turn some stuff off here real quick. Make this a little better. All right. Risk assessments. So if you want to pick through some of the QWRA results, this is where you're going to find it. I think the most important thing is really to ensure that you're using the right layer to answer your question, right? So if we're talking about a planning application, you want to use estimated value change, which reflects relative fire hazard on the landscape. If you're going to try to apply this stuff in the context of an incident that occurs tomorrow, conditional net value change is the layer to use. I guess a big thing to note is that this analysis, at least for the PNW one, is now getting a little bit outdated. We're going to overhaul and update that entire thing this winter. And so you should see a brand new suite of layers on there for this coming fire season. The reason for that is that obviously we've had quite a bit of disturbance across our GAC the last couple of years. So if we're using this to try to frame risk to a number of values, it has to reflect existing disturbance, especially those fresh fire scars from last year. So just know that all that stuff's getting updated. And that is another one I will say that is available to any and all agencies, at least in Oregon and Washington. Okay, so to round this out, I believe the last one on our menu here, fuels, vegetation, prescribed fire. This is one where we should see some changes on here. It's nice to be able to look at where prior year fuel treatments were, right? So there's an interagency layer on here. I guess I should say, I think the data does a pretty decent job for federal agencies. Typically, when I look at this, I do believe it misses a lot of state and local fuel treatments. And it's just a matter of how all that stuff's rounded up by the NIFSI folks on the back end. I think that's the area where we can definitely improve, and I hope we see that in the near future. The prescribed fire data, I guess similar thing there too, as we start to see prescribed fire implementation out there on the landscape. Anything that's been added to NIFs will show up in here, and so you can see that. All right, just anything else I can cover on the map? For you folks that are engaged in ISAP, there's a number of different tools that you can use to facilitate that, right? It's kind of a two-part deal. You can use the spreadsheet that's going to study two things, but boy, is it really, really important and actually a map that goes with it and shows you where those strategic lines are going to be, where the critical values are. Looks like this is taking a minute to load, so I won't waste too much time here, but just know that the RMA dashboard is kind of your first stopping place to get to the tool that you're going to use to either reference that stuff, or if you're driving the ISAP process, this is where you're going to start. Let's see, aviation use. I'm not going to log in and show you this, but for you folks that have a NIFSI AGOL account, I would highly recommend you take a look at this, especially when you got a fire on your home unit and we're using aircraft. This is pretty new. I don't think many folks are actually aware of this. This was a new addition, I believe, August of last year. But it's pretty darn neat in that we have sensors on most of the aircraft that we use. Not all, but most. And so if you want to see where you've had large air tanker drops, VLAT drops, scooper, all that data is shown on here for a specific incident, and it's summarized here statistically, right? So that's pretty neat. The helicopter data, I'll say that, well, it depends on which ships actually have those sensors on them. More and more of our exclusive use aircraft actually have basically a data recorder in the cockpit. So every time the pilot clicks the button on the stick to drop water, basically it records a lat long. Not on all aircraft. So I guess if you're going to go in here and look at this, just know right up front that the helicopter data is going to be incomplete. I would imagine it's going to be that way for several more years. But this is a pretty cool tool. This is updated every 24 hours. Okay, so if you go in here and you're looking at the fire at 1300 when you start flying aircraft on it for the day, just know that essentially you're looking at yesterday's data. You're not looking at something that's quite real time. But personally, I think this is a really, really big step forward for us to know how we're using aviation assets and exactly where we've been using them. This whole thing is not built to facilitate reporting or anything like that. When you go in here and you look at where lines are on a map, Let's see if I can get a good example. When you're looking at drop data, there's nothing on here for this year. I wonder if we can go look at LA. Sure can. Okay. Some good examples. So we've got data here, right? These are line segments, large air tanker and VLAT drops. The key thing for you all to know is that what happens is there is a sensor in the aircraft that picks up door open and door closed, and it's a straight line between those, right? Tankers are flying pretty quickly in some cases. They're also at almost an unknown distance above the ground, right? Although we can record some of that. And so really this is just the point between two lat longs. This does not necessarily mean on the ground. This is exactly where the retardant has gone, right? Does not correct for wind drift or how retardant disperses with respect to altitude, things like that. So just a big disclaimer here, and this is really important for folks to understand. We can't really use this to help us with looking at intrusions. This is a great triage tool if you have that kind of interest in it. The data is not perfect, but frankly, this is far better essay than we've ever had on where retardant in particular is being used. And so for an essay tool, this is a new one that I'd recommend folks pick at. All right.
And there's one question in the chat. Can you export that drop information for retardant avoidance monitoring?
So yes, you can. The data itself is in the NIFC org of ArcGIS Online. But again, I would not use it for avoidance monitoring. I would use this as a triage tool. Okay. So if you pull up and see a layer like this, and let's say we've got an avoidance area in this drainage bottom. If you look at it, this does not 100% answer the question, did we have a misapplication? Okay, this is a place where I would probably suggest sending a resource advisor in on the ground to validate it, or do a low-level flight with a drone or something of that nature to see what's what. It's not that accurate that we can use it for reporting, or at least all the reporting requirements, if that makes sense. Okay. So that was a lot. I'll leave you with this as parting words. The tools and technology piece of this, frankly, I think it's okay for us to just say it's frustrating at times that we have to drink through a fire hose. What I will say is that the linkage between ISAP, Next Gen WFDS, and RMA, we are going to see that strengthen over the next couple of years. Yeah, there's some redundancy in there and maybe some duplication. But as soon as we start to use Next Gen WFDS, that's actually going to help us to reduce some of that redundancy. At least the first pillar of ISAP can be done in there. I would highly recommend that folks really think critically about that first pillar in the off season. ISAP is not a flavor of the month thing that's going to go away. Okay, it's not. Frankly, it's a workflow and a method of making strategic decisions that I think we're already seeing benefits with. With respect to policy and everything that I covered first thing this morning, I think the key thing, especially for the agency here, know what you have to do, and then look for opportunities to innovate, right? Most of our policy is written to spell out pretty specific things that we have to have, but there's decision space within all of them. And it's really up to you to ensure that the quality and time you put into that stuff matches the needs of your units, right? We all know that there's some parts of PNW that just see more fire than others, right? So if you happen to work on one of those units, I'd highly recommend that you take a deep dive into what you've got sitting on the shelf right now and pursue changes accordingly if needed. So, all right, Ed, I owe you all, let's see, a version of this PowerPoint presentation and a bunch of other things. So I'll be busy throwing that stuff in the chat and sending it to you. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Great presentation. We'll go ahead and get that information. We'll get it updated in the portal for everybody. And yeah, if you have any questions for Ian that they come to mind, shoot them over to him. That's what he's here for. He's here to help out. So with that, let's go ahead and take a quick 7-minute break and be back in here at 5 after to move on to our next unit. So thanks, Ian.